Alright, so once you have MATLAB installed and you launch the application, you're going to come into this window over here. So this is what MATLAB looks like. And in here I want to talk about two different things. The first one is what's called the command window, which is this blank space over here in the middle. And the other one is what's called the workspace. So we're going to talk about this and you're going to start getting familiar with the MATLAB environment and what MATLAB looks like and what it's doing behind the scenes when you're entering commands within MATLAB. So again, the command window, as the name implies, is the place where you enter commands for MATLAB to execute. So for example, if I want to, let's say, calculate what 2 times 50 is, that's what I would enter into the command window. So for example, I could say 2 asterisk 50 and hit enter, and MATLAB is going to compute what I entered. So I entered the command being 2 times 50, then I hit enter for MATLAB to execute the command, and it gives me the answer. Over here it says answer equals 100. Now, let's say, for example, that I wanted to define a variable. So I want to define a variable that's called x, for example, and I want to say that x is equal to 10. Again, x is just a variable. So I would say then x equals 10, and notice what's going to happen over here on the workspace on the right. So I enter x equals 10 and then hit enter, and you'll see over here on the right that now I have in the workspace a variable whose name is x and it has a value of 10. So what MATLAB did is once it saw the command x equals 10, then it saves that into the workspace so that you can use in future commands. This is important because if you don't define a variable and then you try to use it in future calculations, then MATLAB doesn't know what it is because you haven't defined it. So for example, I could say now that y is equal to 2 times, let's say 2 times z, for example. So if I hit enter, then MATLAB is telling me now, hey, I don't know what z is because you haven't defined it. So I can't compute y equals 2z because I don't know what z is. You haven't defined that variable. Now, I could do that instead, y equals 2 times x, and it's going to tell me, okay, y equals 20 because you defined x as being equal to 10. And also notice over here on the right that it now saved the value for y as well. So again, the command window is where you enter commands for MATLAB to execute, and there's many different commands, and we'll talk about those commands in later lectures. But again, the command window is where, as the name implies, where you enter the commands for MATLAB to execute. The workspace, on the other hand, is where MATLAB keeps track of those commands and the variables that you defined from your commands. So again, two very important concepts within MATLAB are what's called the command window. That's where you enter commands, and then the workspace is where MATLAB keeps track of all the variables that you've defined. Now, I mentioned this before, and we'll talk a little bit more about different types of functions that you can use within MATLAB. But if you want a list of all the functions that you can use within MATLAB, one thing that you can do is you can type help in the command window. So I can type help over here and hit enter, and MATLAB is going to give me just a message of what it thinks I'm trying to get help for based on the commands that I've entered. So for example, here it's trying to tell me, do you need help for m times function or how to multiply matrices based on the commands that I've given over here. Now, one thing that you can do as well is you can go over here to where it says help and click on that. And then you'll see here that you can get help for MATLAB or Simulink. If we go to MATLAB, then there's different documentation over here that you can get help with. So for example, if I go to programming, or actually let's go ahead and do just getting started, and let's do, for example, 2D and 3D plots. So here there's documentation on how to plot a 2D plot or how to do a 3D plot as well further down. So plots like this. And basically what this is saying is, if you want to do a 2D plot and it gives you an example of a sine wave, for example, these are the commands that you have to enter in the command window. So you can use Control C, so copy those commands and then go back to your command window, for example, and enter those commands. And you'll see that now we're going to get that plot that we saw in the example. So same thing if I go back to help and go back over here, and let's try to do a 3D plot as well. So for example, let's now do this. So copy this whole command, enter it here, and we also need now the plot as well. So we're going to do surf XYZ and then go back to the command window. And again, this may or may not make sense for you yet, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to do these different commands later on. But what I want to show you here is that there's many different functions that you can use within MATLAB to do different things like 2D plots, 3D plots, how to do matrix manipulations, how to define arrays, and many different functions. So if you want to get a complete list of all the functions, then you can go to the help menu and just get it from there. But from here, again, we can see just help on how to do 2D and 3D plots, for example. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the different functions that we can use within MATLAB in later lectures with actual examples. But I just wanted to show you again what the command window is, which is basically where you enter commands, and there's also many different types of commands that MATLAB can take for doing different things, such as just doing simple calculations or doing matrix manipulations or defining arrays, defining vectors, doing 2D and 3D plots, many different applications for MATLAB. And of course, that's very extensive, so I'm not going to go over each one of those, but we'll talk about some of them in later lectures. And again, another important thing over here is what's called the workspace, which is where MATLAB keeps track of all the variables that you've defined within the command window. Now you can always just clear the workspace. So if you click here where it says clear workspace, that's going to get rid of all the variables over here. So the variables that you've defined before, if you clear the workspace, now I cannot use those anymore because I've cleared it. And you can do the same thing for the command. So I can click here where it says clear commands and now have a blank command window as well. So basically this is just like we were starting from scratch. So again, just remember that there's two very important concepts in the MATLAB environment: the command window, which is where we enter commands, and the workspace, which is where MATLAB keeps track of all the variables that you've defined with your commands.